Chapter 4, Section 3, The Southern Colonies, Plantations and Slavery. The main idea of this section is that the economy of the Southern Colonies, that was Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, relied heavily on slave labor. Why does that matter now? Because the existence of slavery deeply affected the South and the nation, especially in the next several hundred years. Terms and names will be defined for you through the Google Classroom that are important to know through this video and the section. Indigo, Eliza Lucas, William Byrd II, Overseer, and the Stono Rebellion. Please make sure to have open your Google Doc and to complete it through this video. When you come to an answer, pause the video, complete the answer or the question, and then resume the video. Please make sure to complete and submit through the Google Classroom when you have completed the entire Google Doc. One American Story. George Mason was born to a wealthy Virginia family in 1725. Mason, who later described the slave trade as, quote, disgraceful to mankind, wrote about the contributions of enslaved persons on his family's plantation. A voice from the past. My father had among his slaves carpenters, coopers, which are barrel makers, sawyers, blacksmiths, tanners, curriers, shoemakers, spinners, weavers, and knitters, and even a distiller. George Mason, quoted in Common Landscape of America. So now we should do our SOAPs analysis on this primary source document. So remember, we want to know who is the speaker, what is the occasion, who is the intended audience, what is the purpose, and what is the subject or the main idea. So go back, listen to the quote again, and see if you can solve or answer all of the questions to the primary source analysis using our SOAPs acronym. So you should have come to the conclusion that obviously the speaker of the document was George Mason. The occasion would have been in Virginia sometime after 1725, if he was born in 1725. So sometime in mid to late 1700s. The audience, most likely this is probably a personal journal, so he himself may have been the audience, or he may have intentionally been keeping a historical record. So we might say that posterity is the intended audience. His purpose is most likely to inform. Inform about what? That would be the subject, the main idea. Basically, he is describing all of the different people who were employed on his father's plantation. Once again, those were carpenters, those who worked with wood, coopers, which would be a barrel maker for storing goods, a sawyer, that's somebody who is also similar to a woodworker, a blacksmith, somebody who would shoe the horses and work with other iron goods, tanners, that would be those who make leather goods, shoemakers, obviously we know what they make, spinners, weavers, and knitters. And a distiller would be somebody who made hard alcohol. So, because the Masons and other wealthy landowners produced all that they needed on their own plantations, they appeared to be independent. But their independence usually depended on the labor of enslaved Africans. Although planters were only a small part of the Southern population, the plantation economy and slavery shaped the life of the Southern colonies, which once again were Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. The plantation economy. The South's soil and almost year-round growing season were ideal for plantation crops like rice and tobacco. These valuable plants required much labor to produce, but with enough workers they could be grown as cash crops. Planters had no trouble transporting their crops because the region's many waterways made it easy for ocean-going ships to tie up at plantation docks. Like George Mason's boyhood home, most plantations were largely self-sufficient. That is, nearly everything that planters, their families, and their workers needed was produced on the plantation. Because plantations were so self-sufficient, Large cities like those in the north were rare in the southern colonies. The port city of Charlestown, later called Charleston, in South Carolina was an early exception. As the plantation economy continued to grow, planters began to have difficulty finding enough laborers to work on their plantations. Toward the end of the 1600s, the planters began to turn to enslaved Africans for labor. The turn to slavery. For the first half of the 1600s, there were very few Africans in Virginia, whether enslaved or free. In 1665, fewer than 500 Africans had been brought into the colony. At that time, African and European indentured servants worked in the fields together. Starting in the 1660s, the labor system began to change as indentured white servants started to leave the plantations. One reason they left was the large amount of land available in the Americas. It was fairly easy for white men to save enough money to buy land and start their own farms. White servants could not be kept on the plantations permanently. As Bacon's Rebellion showed us, it was also politically dangerous for farmers to try and keep them there. As a result, the landowners had to find another source of labor. Planters tried to force Native Americans to work for them, but European diseases caused many Native Americans to die. Those who survived usually knew the country well enough to run away. To meet their labor needs, the planters turned to enslaved Africans. As a result, the population of people of African descent began to grow rapidly. By 1750, there were over 235,000 enslaved Africans in America. About 85% lived in the southern colonies. Enslaved Africans made up about 40% of the South's population. Plantations expand. The growth of slavery allowed plantation farming to expand in South Carolina and Georgia. Without slave labor, there probably would have been no rice plantations in the region's swampy lowlands. Enslaved workers drained swamps, raked fields, burned stubble, and broke ground before planting. They also had to flood, drain, dry, hoe, and weed the same fields several times before harvest. The cultivation of rice required not only back-breaking labor, but also considerable skill. Because West Africans had these skills, planters sought out slaves who came from Africa's rice-growing regions. On higher ground, planters grew indigo, a plant that yields a deep blue dye. A young woman named Eliza Lucas had introduced indigo as a successful plantation crop after her father sent her to supervise his South Carolina plantations when she was 17. William Byrd II, from 1674 until his death in 1744. William Byrd II was one of the best known of the Southern planters. His family owned a large estate in Virginia. After his father died, Byrd took on his father's responsibilities, including membership in the House of Burgesses. But Byrd is best remembered for his writing. His most famous work is History of the Dividing Line Betwixt Virginia and North Carolina. In it, Byrd celebrates the land and climate of the South. At times, however, he is critical of its people. Even today, the book creates a vivid picture of life in the Southern colonies. The planter class. Slave labor allowed planters, such as the Byrd family of Virginia, to become even wealthier. These families formed an elite planter class. They had money or credit to buy most slaves, and because they had more slaves, they could grow more tobacco, rice, or indigo to sell. Small landowners with just one or two slaves simply could not compete. Many gave up their land and moved westward. As a result, the powerful planter class gained control of the rich land across the coast. The planter class was relatively small compared to the rest of the population. However, this upper class soon took control of political and economic power in the South. A foreign traveler in the South commented that the planters, quote, think and act precisely as do the nobility in other countries. Some planters, following the traditions of nobility, did feel responsible for the welfare of their enslaved workers. Power, they believed, brought with it the responsibility to do good. Many planters, though, were tyrants. They held complete authority over everyone in their households. Planters frequently used violence against slaves to enforce their will. Life under slavery. On large southern plantations, slaves toiled in groups of about 20 to 25 under the supervision of overseers. Overseers were men hired by planters to watch over and direct the work of slaves. Enslaved persons performed strenuous and exhausting work, often for 15 hours a day at the peak of the harvest season. If slaves did not appear to be doing their full share of work, they were often whipped by the overseer. Enslaved people usually lived in small, one-room cabins that were furnished with only sleeping cots. For a week's food, a slave might receive only around a quarter bushel of corn and a pound of pork. Some planters allowed their slaves to add to this meager ration by letting them raise their own potatoes, greens, fruit, or chicken. In spite of the brutal living conditions, Africans preserved many customs of beliefs from their homelands. This included music, dances, stories, and for a time, African religions, including Islam. African kinship customs became the basis of African American family culture. A network of kin was a source of strength, even when families were separated. Resistance to slavery. At the same time that enslaved Africans struggled to maintain their own culture, they fought against their enslavement. They sometimes worked slowly, damaged goods, or purposely carried out orders the wrong way. A British traveler in 1746 noted that many slaves pretended not to understand tasks they often had performed as farmers in West Africa. A voice from the past. You would really be surprised at their perseverance. Let 100 men show him how to hoe or drive a wheelbarrow. He'll still take the one by the bottom and the other by the wheel. And they often die before they can be conquered. Edward Kimber, quoted in White Over Black. At times, slaves became so angry and frustrated by their loss of freedom that they rose up in rebellion. One of the most famous incidents was the Stono Rebellion. In September of 1739, about 20 slaves gathered at the Stono River just south of Charlestown. Wielding guns and other weapons, they killed several planter families and marched south, beating drums and loudly inviting other slaves to join them in their plan to seek freedom in Spanish-held Florida. By late that afternoon, however, a white militia had surrounded the group of escaping slaves. The two sides clashed, and many slaves died in the fighting. Those captured were executed. Stono and similar revolts led planters to make slave codes even stricter. Slaves were now forbidden from leaving plantations without permission. The laws also made it illegal for slaves to meet with free blacks. Such laws made the conditions of slavery even more inhumane. The Southern Colonies' plantations economy and widespread use of slaves set the region on a very different path from that of the New England and Middle colonies. In the next section, you will learn how settlers used the unique resources of the backcountry to create settlements there. This is the end of the section. You should be able to answer a few questions at this point. First, what percentage of the South's population was enslaved in the 1750s? Second, what crops did the plantations in Georgia and South Carolina grow? Third, how did enslaved persons resist their slavery? Finally, how did the geographic differences between the Southern colonies and the New England colonies affect their labor system? Keep in mind the climate of both regions and the nature of the soil the difference between New England and the Southern colonies. Also, please make sure that you have completed your Google Doc through the Google Classroom and have submitted it for homework. And we'll see you in class tomorrow.